Welcome to this weird version of Jeopardy! So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to go through each column 100 to 500 from left to right, so starting with evidence and ending with cladograms. Our categories for this evening are evidence for evolution, natural selection, 3 different types of classification. So we're going to focus on invertebrates, vertebrates, and then plants. And then our last category is cladograms. So starting from evidence, let's talk about number 100. What is the difference between gradual adaptations and punctuated equilibrium? So this is something that we have talked about before. But again, just to reiterate, when we're talking about gradualism, right, you have like slow moving changes. You can see changes, but it's like all very slow, very fluid, whereas punctuated equilibrium is like very blocky, so you have a change and then nothing, and then a change and then nothing. So you don't get any of those in-betweens. For 200, what is the difference between analogous, homologous, and vestigial? I'm going to assume it says structures under there. Yep. So analogous, well, I guess I could show you the answer, right? Analogous is the same function, different structure. So think bird wing and butterfly wing. They both fly, but they're not even remotely close in structure. Homologous is the opposite of that. Same structure, different function. Think whale fin and your arm. They both are made up of the same bones, but I don't use my arms to swim the way a whale does, and I would definitely not survive swimming in the ocean like a whale does. And then vestigial structures are just structures with no function anymore. So like our wisdom teeth, our appendix, we don't really have a real function for them, but they exist still. For 300, what is adaptive radiation? So this is a version of evolution where organisms diversify rapidly from one common ancestor. So you have a common ancestor, like the Galapagos finches, for example, and they went and landed on the Galapagos Islands, and then they all really quickly diversified themselves to fit into these specific niches that existed already on the Galapagos Islands. So it was a relatively quick change. For 400, what is transient polymorphism? So again, you should be breaking down these words to try and get as much as you can out of just the prefixes, suffixes, and any word that you know in between, right? So before we even go on to the next page, you should know that poly means many, and morphism means like looks, the way it looks. So transient polymorphism is organisms having more than one form and switching between forms, right? So think of the peppered moths, right? They were all like light beigey gray colored, and then due to environmental changes, they had an adaptation that was favorable, and so they became those dark moths, but they are an example of transient polymorphism. So they can move from one end to the other for ranges, and they have 2 distinct forms. And then last but not least, for 500 points, I'm definitely winning, by the way, by myself, I'm winning. What is the difference in relative dating and absolute dating with fossils? So relative, just again, look at these words, don't even think about anything else. You know what relative means, like you're relatively close. Yeah, you kind of know, but you're not like 1,000% sure, whereas absolute is you are absolutely sure that something is true. And it's kind of the same with fossils, whereas relative is talking about the layers of rock. So the deepest is the oldest. And yes, you can say that, you know, the fossils found in a deeper layer is older, but you couldn't tell me exactly how old those fossils were. And that's why relative dating is you're relatively there, but you're not, you know, you're not giving me the real facts. whereas absolute measures radioactive carbons. And in that case, you can actually find out exact ages of these fossils that are found. All right, that was our first category. We're going to move on to natural selection now. So for 100, what is variation? Hopefully this is not tripping you up. Variation is just differences within a population, right? Brown hair versus blonde hair, that's a variation. I don't know, blue eyes versus brown eyes, variations. For 200, what are 4 ways organisms can struggle for survival? So there are more than 4 ways, but I'm just going to give you a few ways that organisms can struggle. Competition for food, space, mates, parasitism, predation, disease. There are even more than this that would be acceptable as an answer, but here's some examples of ways that organisms struggle for survival. For 300, what is survival of the fittest? You hear this all the time. It is nothing to do with how strong you are, okay? So you don't need to be able to lift 400 pounds. You just need to be able to reproduce more. So stronger individuals will reproduce more. And the survival, like the word survival in this kind of like saying is talking about being able to pass your genes on. So as your genes get passed on, you are surviving because your genes make up who you are, and if your genes still exist in the gene pool, then you are surviving. And the fittest individuals are those that have the ability to survive in the situation that they are. So survival of the fittest is the strongest individuals, meaning the ones most highly adapted to the environment that they are, will reproduce more. All right, for 400, explain how mutations are selected for and against. So this is kind of what we were talking about with the last one. If an organism is well suited to an environment, then they're going to reproduce. And if they continue to reproduce, then those traits are going to continue to be in the gene pool. And if those traits are continued to be in the gene pool, that means that they were selected for, meaning that they were a positive thing and they were worth keeping around, right? And if they're not well suited, then they're not going to mate. And if they don't mate, then those traits disappear from the gene pool, and so they're selected against. And for 500, explain antibiotic resistance. So antibiotics work on bacteria, and bacteria reproduce so quickly, like 20 minutes. Every 20 minutes, bacteria are splitting. And they can mutate to become resistant to antibiotics. So if you take antibiotics and you're sick or whatever, you take antibiotics, those antibiotics are going to eliminate any bacteria that are weak against the antibiotics. However, if a bacteria mutates and has the resistance, then they're going to be able to survive beyond those antibiotics and continue to make you sick. In addition, if you don't use enough of, like say you get a 10-day supply of antibiotics, whatever they may be, and you only use 6 days of them because you start to feel better, there are still bacteria that exist in your body, but now they've been exposed to these antibiotics, and so they can take in some of the DNA that is resistant, because bacteria can take in DNA from other bacteria through a bridge. We'll get to that next unit, but they can take in other bacteria, and so then you can create resistant bacteria to antibiotics. It's actually a thing that's happening. It's very horrifying, but it is a thing that's happening currently. All right, so we're going to get into our classification situation. So we're starting off with invertebrates. So which invertebrate classification includes insects, spiders, and crustaceans? This right here should probably be your obvious one, or at least it is for me, spiders. I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm afraid of spiders. I just know more about spiders. But arthropods are is the phylum for those things, those organisms. For 200, this is how they're all pretty much going to be. What invertebrate classification includes snails? So think only about snails. Think about those shells. Mollusks. You guys had a question about this on one of your tests this year, so hopefully this wasn't like brand new information. Name 2 invertebrates that have bilateral symmetry. As a reminder, when we were talking, the invertebrates that you had to know about, quite a few had bilateral symmetry, but they didn't all have radial symmetry, so you should be able to knock off a few, or at least one, right off the bat. But here you are. Platyhelminthes, those are flatfishes, mollusks, annelida, arthropods, and echinodermata, which are like starfish. $400. Which invertebrate has no mouth and no anus? These are the types of things that you will just have to know and pull from. Even though these questions are deliberately asking you like rote memorization type things, where like you should just memorize that chart and then be able to pull from it. In an IB question, they will expect you to know this stuff and then build off of it. But anyways, no mouth, no anus, that's porifera. We're talking like sponges. And then for 500, what is an example of porifera, cnidaria, and annelida? I've been kind of giving you some examples along the way. I just gave you this one. This one was in your note check. And then this one is like earthworms, but... So sponges, again, right? Porifera is sponges. Cnidaria is jellyfish. That is your only one that has radial symmetry. And then annelida is anything with a segmented body. So like leeches, earthworms. Like you've seen earthworms where they have those like rings all around their, like all the way down their body. Each segment is what has brought it into this category of annelida. And leeches are gross, so you probably know what they look like though. All right, that was invertebrates. Now we're going to go to vertebrates, which maybe you're a little bit more familiar with. So for 100, how do mammals breathe? How do they breathe? With lungs. That was not a trick question. It should have been, hopefully you didn't have to think too much. You're a mammal. How do you breathe? With lungs. And you have alveoli inside for gas exchange. So you are intaking oxygen and exchanging that for carbon dioxide and exhaling the carbon dioxide. For 200, describe the limbs of aves. So you have to know what that is and then understand what the limbs are. So aves are birds. So what do the limbs look like? You have wings, and then you have legs, right? They do have 2 legs, and they do have 2 wings, so they are considered tetrapods, but remember that if I asked you what limbs you had, you would say arms and legs. So make sure that when you're thinking of limbs, you're thinking of all limbs. For 300, describe the body surface of reptilian organisms. So think about what like a lizard looks like or a snake, right? They're covered in scales and they have pretty impermeable skin, right? They're pretty tough, kind of leathery. You know what these things look like, so just bring up images in your head and it should help you answer these questions. For 400, differentiate between, oh goodness, chondrichthyes and osteichthyes. This has to, I feel like I'm quizzing myself right now. This has to do with fish or ocean-dwelling organisms and dealing with bony versus cartilaginous. So, whew, killing it. I took a whole class on this stuff, that's how I know it. So Chondrichthyes is a cartilaginous fish. So think of like sharks, and other, I don't know, cartilaginous fish. I don't know a lot about fish, but I just know that. And then Osteichthyes is an endoskeleton is made of bone. So the difference here is whether the skeleton, the inner skeleton, is made up of cartilage or made up of bones. And then for 500, differentiate between monotremes, marsupials, and placental mammals. So these are the three types of mammals that you could have, and it really deals with birth. This is how you would differentiate them. So monotremes lay eggs like a platypus. Okay, so they lay eggs. They are considered a mammal still, but they lay eggs. Marsupials give birth to not fully developed babies, like a koala, where they need to continue to be with the mom until they fully develop. And then placental mammals develop fully inside of the mother, right? Like humans. We're fully developed when we are born. We're just useless when we're born, but we are fully developed. All right. Next on the old list is classification of plants. At this point, you guys should be like feeling pretty decent with plants. We've done it quite a few times now. So plants for 100. Which classification of plants have no vascular tissue? Think about this. Which one doesn't have anything? We're talking mosses, like bryophyte. Whenever you are answering an IB question, if you know the phylum, like in this case, you say this was a question, right? An IB question, and it specifically asked you what classification of plants does not have vascular system. If you had said moss, you probably would get that wrong. You would have to say the actual classification, which would be bryophytes. You could say bryophytes like moss, but if you just said moss, you might not get the full points. For 200, which two classifications of plants have cambium? Cambium. Remember, that's in a stem. And the only ones that really have stems that would grow big enough to have cambium would be conifers and angiosperms. So think like pine trees and flowering plants. For 300, which classification of plants includes liverworts? Liverworts. Where have you ever heard that word before? Bryophytes. This is a sort of obscure, but not really. I mean, how many types of mosses and stuff do you know, right? So liverwort is one of them now. Now you know. For 400, which classification of plants includes grasses? So think about the different things. Does grass have a vascular system? Does grass have cambium? Does grass have flowers? It is a flowering plant, and it's an angiosperm. It's annoying. That's not in one line. And for 500, explain how each of the 4 classifications of plants reproduce. So think about how the plants reproduce. Think about how flowering plants, you should absolutely know this, how they reproduce. Conifers have a similar situation, but not totally the same. Philocynophytes, they have a very unique way. Okay, so bryophytes and philocynophytes are totally different from conifers and angiosperms because they use spores. Not when you think of plants, well, maybe this is just me, but when I think of plants, I don't typically think of spores. When I think of spores, I think mushrooms. not necessarily plants. So just keep that in mind. They use spores. So they release spores, and then those spores get taken via wind, rain, animals, and then they're deposited somewhere else for growth. Conifers use cones, right? Pine trees, you know, pine cones. That's the reproductive organ for conifers. And then angiosperms use fruits and flowers to spread pollen. All right, we are into our last column, all about cladograms. So start easy and get more challenging. So for 100 fake internet points, what does a node show? What is the definition of a node in relation to a cladogram? And that is a speciation event, some event that has now differentiated that line into more than one line, two or more. For 200 points, what is a clade? So a node would be like where like a common ancestor would be, and then what is a clade? And that is what comes off of that node. So the node has differentiated species into more than one, right? It's a speciation event that has changed that line into multiple lines, and then the clade is that group of species that is formed from that node. So they all derive from a singular common ancestor. One clade equals species from one common ancestor. For 300, what are cladograms mostly based on? DNA. You can like chant this. Chant this in your brain, right? DNA, DNA. Cladograms are used and used so frequently because we use DNA and amino acid sequences. And because we use those both for genomes and proteomes, we have a much better understanding of it. And in addition to that, the understanding is backed up with actual science, right? You can, like, DNA is much more trustworthy than, you know, looking at something and say, I think maybe you're related to this other thing that looks like you, right? That's like, we don't like that. We don't like to do that because it's so unreliable. But using DNA or amino acids, that's super reliable. All right, we're down to 2. So for 400, explain how you would show an extinct species on a cladogram. There are a few ways to show extinction on a cladogram, but the most common way to do it is to have a short tip. So it would basically, like if you had a cladogram, it would just not line up with all the present day species. It would end sooner. And if it ends sooner, that means that it didn't make it to present day, right? And so you can assume that it's extinct. And last, but certainly not least, I don't know what this question is, but last but not least, explain the reclassification of figworts. Weren't we just talking about this in class today? So, I mean, we talked about this. It's in the notes as well. But the reclassification of figworts is using DNA to find out the common ancestors of figworts. So even though they were already classified as something else based on how they looked, this was due to convergent evolution, meaning that they existed in the same area, so they evolved to show similar traits, but they were in fact not related through a common ancestor. So once they actually ran the DNA, they were able to identify the true common ancestors of figworts and reclassify it in its proper place. All right. And our last question is our, what is it called? Final Jeopardy? Final Jeopardy. It's all about dichotomous keys. Now, it is asking you to create a dichotomous key. Of course, I'm not going to make a full dichotomous key, but a good way to break this up, my first piece would be, does it have, I don't know, something like, does it have a perpendicular angle to it or something like that? I don't know. Or does it have threading? I might actually say, does it have threading, which would knock out these 5 to these 3 kind of white ones. And so breaking them into those groups, I would then break down these groups. Does it have a hole in the middle of it? Yes or no, and then I would get nail, and then I would break these 2 down. Is it square shaped or is it a hexagon shape? And that would break these 2 down. And then I would start moving into the the threaded screws. And so I would, something along the lines of, does it have a divot at the top? And then that would break down these 3 to these 2, and then I would break these 2 down even further. Does it have an extended, I don't know what these are called, but extended piece off of it, or is it a shorter piece off of it? And then I would break those 2 down, and then these ones would be kind of similar. Is it a diagonal threading? Yes or no, that would break that one off. And then is it have a rhombus parallelogram? I don't know, shape versus a semicircle shape. And so I would just continuously break it down until I had separated all 8 of them into a separate category, asking yes or no or distinct questions that would continue to break the group into smaller pieces until they were all separated. All right. That's it for Jeopardy! I hope you enjoyed. I certainly did. This was fun to do, I guess. All right, let me know if you have any further questions.